The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and something else, something that made Daniel Jackson pause in his chopping. Blood. Fresh blood on the autumn air, drifting down from the ridge trail that wound past his cabin like a scar through the wilderness. He set down his axe and listened, his weathered hands still against the split wood. 20 years of living alone in these Colorado peaks had taught him to read the mountain's moods. And today, something was wrong. Christina Alvarez pressed her back against the rough bark of a towering spruce, her breath coming in ragged gasps that sent white puffs into the crisp October air. The bruises on her face throbbed with each heartbeat, the left side of her jaw swollen so badly she could barely open her mouth. Her right arm cradled her belly protectively, where the life growing inside her had become both her greatest hope and her most dangerous burden. 5 months along, and still the nausea came in waves, especially when fear gripped her like it did now. She had been walking for 3 days since fleeing the mining camp, surviving on creek water and the few berries she could find that had not yet surrendered to the approaching winter. Her shoes, thin leather things meant for indoor work, had split open on the rocky trail, leaving her feet bloody and raw. The dress she wore, once a cheerful blue cotton, now hung torn and stained, offering little protection against the mountain cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. Behind her, somewhere in the maze of pine and aspen that covered the mountainside, she could hear them calling. Their voices carried on the wind like the howl of wolves, growing closer with each passing hour. They had found her trail at the creek crossing 2 miles back, and now they were closing in with the methodical patience of men who knew these mountains better than she ever could. Daniel heard the voices too, harsh and demanding, echoing off the granite walls of the canyon below his cabin. He counted at least 3 men, maybe 4, their words too distant to make out, but their intent clear in the aggressive tone that cut through the forest silence. His jaw tightened as he recognized the sound of a hunt, and his mind went immediately to the stories that drifted up from the mining camps in the valleys below. Stories of women who disappeared, of men who took what they wanted and left only silence behind. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to survive in a place where mistakes could be fatal. His rifle, a well-maintained Winchester that had served him faithfully for 15 years, hung above the cabin door within easy reach. He took it down and checked the action, the familiar weight of the weapon steady in his hands. The mountain had taught him many lessons, but perhaps the most important was this. Sometimes a man had to choose between his solitude and his conscience, and that choice revealed everything about what kind of man he truly was. Christina stumbled as her foot caught in a tangle of exposed roots, and she went down hard on her knees. The impact sent a sharp pain through her belly, and for a terrifying moment she thought she might lose the baby right there on the forest floor. She pressed both hands against her stomach and held her breath, waiting for the cramping to pass. The child inside her shifted and kicked, as if responding to her distress, and she felt a wave of relief so intense it brought tears to her eyes. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. She had to keep moving. Behind her, the voices were getting closer, and she could hear the snap of breaking branches as her pursuers forced their way through the underbrush. They were not trying to be quiet anymore, which meant they were confident they had her cornered. The trail ahead curved around a massive boulder, and beyond that she could see smoke rising from what looked like a chimney. A cabin isolated and far from any settlement she knew of. It might be her salvation, or it might be just another trap. The men hunting her were led by Thomas Evans, the foreman of the Copper Creek mine where she had worked in the company store. A hard man with small, cruel eyes and hands that had wandered where they should not have gone. When she had tried to tell the mine supervisor about his behavior, Evans had laughed and suggested that perhaps she had been asking for his attention. When she had threatened to write to the territorial authorities, he had shown her just how far his influence extended in the isolated mining community. The bruises on her face were his handiwork, delivered 3 nights ago when she had finally found the courage to fight back. She had managed to get away in the confusion, slipping out of the company boarding house while Evans was still cursing and nursing his own injuries. But she knew he would not let her escape so easily. A woman who fought back was a dangerous thing in a place where men made all the rules. Daniel stepped out onto his porch and scanned the tree line, his eyes searching for movement among the shadows. The voices had stopped, which worried him more than if they had continued calling. Silent hunters were the most dangerous kind. He had built his cabin here precisely because it was difficult to approach without being seen. The clearing positioned so that anyone coming up the trail would be visible for 100 yards in any direction. The woman appeared first, stumbling into the open space before his cabin like a wounded deer breaking from cover. Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat as he took in her condition. Her face was a map of violence, purple and yellow bruises marking where someone had used their fists with deliberate cruelty. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing more bruises on her collarbone, and the way she moved suggested injuries he could not see. But it was her eyes that struck him most, windowed with fear, but still holding a spark of defiance that spoke to something unbroken inside her. Christina saw the man on the porch and froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was tall and lean, with dark hair gone gray at the temples and a beard that had not seen a razor in weeks. His clothes were rough but clean, the practical garments of a man who worked with his hands. But it was the rifle in his hands that held her attention. The way he held it with casual familiarity that spoke of long experience with violence. For a moment they stared at each other across the clearing, two strangers caught in a tableau of uncertainty. Then the sound of approaching footsteps crashed through the forest behind her, and Christina made her choice. She ran toward the cabin, her torn shoes slipping on the pine needles that carpeted the ground. Daniel watched her approach and felt something shift inside his chest, a feeling he had thought buried with his wife Sarah 15 years ago. The protective instinct that had once made him a good husband and might have made him a good father rose up like a tide, washing away the careful isolation he had built around himself. When Christina stumbled and nearly fell just short of the porch steps, he moved without thinking, setting his rifle aside and stepping forward to catch her arm. The touch was electric, the first gentle human contact Christina had experienced in longer than she could remember. His hands were calloused but careful, supporting her weight without causing additional pain. She looked up into his face and saw something there that made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. Kindness. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her with simple human kindness that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. Daniel helped her up the steps and into the cabin, his mind racing as he tried to process what he was seeing. The woman was clearly pregnant, probably 4 or 5 months along, based on the gentle curve of her belly, visible beneath her torn dress. Someone had beaten her badly and recently, the bruises on her face still fresh and angry. And now someone was hunting her through his mountains, with the persistence of men who meant to finish what they had started. The cabin was sparse but clean, furnished with handmade furniture that spoke of long winter evenings spent in solitary work. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking pot hanging from an iron hook and split wood stacked neatly beside the hearth. The single room served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom, with a narrow bed pushed against the far wall and shelves lined with books, tools, and supplies. It was the home of a man who had learned to live with only what he needed, nothing wasted and everything in its place. Christina sank into a chair beside the table, her legs finally giving out as the adrenaline that had carried her this far began to fade. The warmth of the cabin was a shock after 3 days in the cold, and she could not stop herself from shivering as her body began to remember what comfort felt like. She watched Daniel move around the small space with quiet efficiency, banking the fire, and checking the windows with the automatic movements of a man accustomed to potential danger. Outside, the voices had resumed, closer now and more urgent. Thomas Evans was calling her name, his voice carrying the false concern of a man who had practiced deception until it came as naturally as breathing. He was telling anyone who might be listening that they were looking for a disturbed woman who had stolen from the mining company, a dangerous person who might hurt herself or others. The lies came so smoothly that Christina almost believed them herself. Daniel heard the voices and felt his jaw clench with anger. He had heard that tone before, in the voices of men who had come to his mountain looking for runaway slaves in the years before the war, and later in the voices of those who hunted down striking miners and union organizers. It was the sound of men who believed their authority gave them the right to pursue and punish, regardless of justice or mercy. He moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains, counting the figures moving through the trees below. 4 men, all armed, spreading out to surround the cabin with the practiced coordination of a military unit. They knew their business, these hunters, and they were not going to be easily discouraged. Daniel felt the familiar weight of decisions settling on his shoulders. The moment when a man had to choose what kind of person he was going to be. Christina spoke for the first time since entering the cabin, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the small space. Who hurt you? The words were not quite a question, more like a statement of fact delivered with quiet intensity. She looked up at Daniel and saw something in his eyes that made her believe he might actually care about the answer. Thomas Evans, she said simply, and watched Daniel's expression harden as he processed the name. The foreman at Copper Creek Mine. He said I belonged to him now, that carrying his child made me his property. When I tried to leave, he decided to teach me about the consequences of defying him. Daniel felt a cold rage building in his chest, the kind of anger that had once made him a dangerous man in a different life. He had seen what men like Evans could do to women who had no one to protect them, had witnessed the casual cruelty that some people mistook for strength. The bruises on Christina's face told a story he had heard too many times, and the fear in her eyes spoke of violations that went deeper than physical violence. The sound of boots on his porch steps interrupted his thoughts, and Daniel moved quickly to position himself between Christina and the door. He picked up his rifle and checked that a round was chambered, the metallic click loud in the sudden silence. Outside, he could hear the men positioning themselves around the cabin, their movements careful but not quite quiet enough to escape his experienced ear. A heavy fist pounded on the door, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the cabin like gunshots. Thomas Evans's voice followed, pitched to carry the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Open up in there. We know you have her. We just want to talk, settle this whole misunderstanding peaceful-like. No need for anyone to get hurt over a simple domestic dispute. Daniel looked back at Christina and saw her flinch at the sound of Evan's voice, her hands instinctively moving to protect her belly. The fear in her eyes was real and immediate, the reaction of someone who knew exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. Daniel made his decision with the clarity that came from years of living by simple principles. Protect the innocent, stand against the cruel, and never back down when you knew you were right. He moved to the door but did not open it, speaking through the heavy wood in a voice that carried the quiet authority of a man who was comfortable with violence. You are not welcome here, Evans. The woman is under my protection now. I suggest you and your men turn around and head back down the mountain before this gets complicated. There was a moment of silence, then Evans's laughter, harsh and mocking. You do not even know what you are dealing with, mountain man. That woman in there is a thief and a whore, carrying a bastard child and running from justice. You harboring her makes you an accessory to her crimes. Now open this door and let us take her back where she belongs, or we will come in and get her ourselves. Daniel felt Christina move behind him, heard the soft scrape of her chair as she stood up. When he glanced back, he saw her reaching for something on the shelf beside the fireplace, her movements careful and deliberate. It was a knife, a long-bladed hunting knife, that he used for skinning game and other necessary tasks. She held it with the grip of someone who knew how to use it, and her eyes had taken on a hardness that had not been there moments before. I will not go back, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I will not let him touch my child. If they come through that door, I will fight them with everything I have, even if it kills me. But I will not go back to being his property. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without the need for words. They were strangers thrown together by circumstance, but they shared something now that transcended the accident of their meeting. They both knew what it meant to stand against cruelty, to choose principle over safety, to risk everything for the chance to remain human in an inhumane world. Outside, Evans was losing patience. His voice rose as he shouted orders to his men, positioning them at the windows and back door of the cabin. The pretense of civilized negotiation was falling away, revealing the brutal reality underneath. These were men who took what they wanted by force, and they had not climbed this mountain to be turned away by the moral objections of a hermit and his unexpected guest. The first shot came without warning, a rifle bullet that splintered the doorframe just inches from Daniel's head. Wood fragments scattered across the cabin floor as he threw himself to the side, pulling Christina down with him behind the heavy wooden table that served as his dining surface. More shots followed, the windows exploding inward in a shower of glass and lead as Evans's men opened fire from multiple positions around the cabin. Daniel rolled to his knees and brought his Winchester to bear, finding a gap in the wall where he could return fire without exposing himself completely. His first shot took one of the attackers in the shoulder, spinning the man around and sending him crashing into the trees behind the cabin. The second shot missed, but it forced the other gunman to take cover, buying precious seconds of breathing room. Christina pressed herself against the floor, her arms wrapped protectively around her belly as bullets whistled overhead. The baby was moving frantically inside her, responding to her elevated heart rate and the adrenaline flooding her system. She closed her eyes and tried to project calm toward the life growing within her, silently promising that she would find a way to keep them both safe no matter what it cost. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by the sound of settling debris and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Daniel kept his rifle trained on the broken window, waiting for movement, while Christina remained motionless behind their makeshift barricade. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, mixing with the scent of pine and the metallic taste of fear. Evan's voice cut through the quiet, closer now, probably just outside the shattered door. "You are only making this harder on yourself, Mountain Man. We have got you surrounded, and we have got all day. That woman in there is not worth dying for, especially when you do not even know what she has done. She stole money from the company store, seduced married men, caused nothing but trouble since the day she arrived at our camp. You are protecting a criminal and a whore, and for what? Some misguided notion of chivalry." Daniel felt Christina stiffen beside him at Evan's words, saw the way her face flushed with shame and anger. He reached out and touched her hand briefly, a gesture of solidarity that seemed to steady her. The lies Evans was telling were probably believed by some people, Daniel knew. It was easier to blame the victim than to confront the reality of what men like Evans did to women who had no power to resist them. "You are the one who is lying, Evans," Daniel called back, his voice carrying clearly through the damaged door. "I have seen what you did to her face, seen the fear in her eyes when she hears your voice. A man who beats a pregnant woman is no man at all, just a coward with a badge who thinks his position gives him the right to abuse those under his authority." The response was immediate and violent. Evans kicked in what remained of the door, his face twisted with rage as he stepped into the cabin with his pistol drawn. Behind him came two more men, their rifles ready, their eyes scanning the interior for targets. They had abandoned any pretense of legal authority now, revealing themselves as what they had always been: predators who used their positions to satisfy their appetites for violence and control. Daniel rose from behind the table with fluid grace, his Winchester already aimed at Evan's chest. For a frozen moment, the two men faced each other across the small cabin, their weapons trained on each other with deadly precision. Christina remained on the floor, her knife ready, her eyes moving between the armed men who would decide her fate in the next few seconds. Time seemed suspended, balanced on the edge of a blade that could fall either way. Daniel could see the calculation in Evans's eyes, the weighing of odds and consequences that preceded violence. He could smell the man's sweat and fear, could see the slight tremor in his gun hand that suggested Evans was not as confident as he pretended to be. This was not the mining camp where Evans's word was law, not a place where he could act with impunity. The standoff stretched for heartbeats that felt like hours, each man waiting for the other to make the first move. Daniel had the advantage of position and cover, but Evans had numbers and the desperate fury of a man whose authority had been challenged. The two men behind Evans shifted nervously, their rifles moving between Daniel and the spot where Christina crouched behind the overturned table. It was Christina who broke the stalemate, rising slowly from behind her shelter with the hunting knife held steady in her grip. Her face was pale but determined, her eyes fixed on Evans with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step backward. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying none of the fear that had marked her earlier words. "You want me, Thomas. Here I am. But you will have to kill me to take me back. And even then you will never have what you really want. You will never break me the way you have broken other women. I would rather die free than live as your slave." Evan's face contorted with a mixture of lust and rage that made Daniel's finger tighten on his trigger. The man was beyond reason now, driven by the kind of obsession that turned human beings into monsters. Daniel had seen it before. in the eyes of men who had convinced themselves that their desires justified any action, no matter how cruel or destructive. "You think you have a choice," Evans snarled, his pistol swinging toward Christina. "You think this mountain man can protect you from what you are. But I know what you are, girl. I know what you need, what you want, even if you are too stubborn to admit it. You will come with me now, or I will take you back in pieces." Daniel's shot took Evans in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying across the cabin floor. The foreman screamed and clutched at his wounded arm, blood seeping between his fingers as he staggered against the wall. The two men behind him raised their rifles, but Daniel was already moving, diving to the side as their shots splintered the wood where he had been standing. Christina moved like lightning, her knife flashing as she lunged at the nearest gunman. The blade caught him in the forearm, drawing a howl of pain and surprise as he dropped his weapon and stumbled backward. She followed up with a knee to his groin that doubled him over, then brought the knife handle down on the back of his skull with enough force to send him crashing to the floor. The remaining gunman hesitated for a crucial second, torn between helping his wounded companions and maintaining his aim at Daniel. That moment of indecision cost him everything. Daniel's second shot caught him center mass, lifting him off his feet and sending him tumbling through the broken doorway onto the porch outside. Evans was still conscious, though weakening from blood loss, his face gray with shock and pain. He looked up at Daniel with hatred burning in his eyes, his mouth working as he tried to form words through gritted teeth. "This is not over," he gasped. "There are more men coming, more than you can handle. The company will not let this stand. They will hunt you both down like the animals you are." Daniel walked over to where Evans lay against the wall and looked down at him with cold disgust. "The company can send whoever they want," he said quietly, "but they will find the same welcome you did. This mountain does not suffer bullies gladly, and neither do I. You would be wise to remember that when you are explaining to your bosses how you lost 3 men trying to retrieve 1 pregnant woman." Christina moved to Daniel's side, her knife still ready, her breathing heavy from exertion and adrenaline. The fight had awakened something fierce inside her, a strength she had not known she possessed. For the first time since fleeing the mining camp, she felt like she might actually survive this ordeal. More than that, she felt like she might be able to build something better from the ashes of her old life. The wounded man on the floor was stirring, groaning as consciousness returned. Daniel quickly disarmed him and used rope from his supplies to bind his hands behind his back. Evans was too weak to pose an immediate threat, but Daniel tied him as well, unwilling to take chances with Christina's safety. The dead man on the porch would serve as a warning to anyone else who might be following the trail up the mountain. As the immediate danger passed, Daniel found himself studying Christina with new eyes. The frightened, beaten woman who had stumbled into his clearing was gone, replaced by someone harder and more resilient. She moved with purpose now, checking the cabin for additional weapons and supplies with the practical efficiency of someone who understood that survival required constant vigilance. "The baby," she said suddenly, her hand moving to her belly with a look of concern. "The fighting, the stress, I need to make sure." She sat down heavily in the chair by the fireplace, her face pale as she pressed both hands against her stomach and waited. After a few tense moments, she smiled with relief. Still moving, still strong. This child has already survived more than most people face in a lifetime. Daniel felt something twist in his chest at her words, a mixture of admiration and protective instinct that surprised him with its intensity. He had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to care about another person's well-being, to have someone else's safety matter more than his own comfort. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying, a reminder of vulnerabilities he had thought safely buried. "We need to move," he said, his practical mind already working through the logistics of their situation. Evans was right about one thing: there will be more men coming. The mining companies have too much invested in maintaining their authority to let this challenge go unanswered. We have maybe a day before they organize a larger force and come back up the mountain. Christina nodded, understanding the reality of their situation, even as her heart sank at the thought of leaving the first safe haven she had found in weeks. "Where can we go? The mining camps control most of the valleys, and winter is coming. A pregnant woman and a man marked as an outlaw will not find many places willing to shelter us." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, thinking through options that all seemed fraught with danger. There was a place, he said finally, higher up in the mountains, an old mining claim that was abandoned when the silver played out 5 years ago. The buildings are still standing, and there is a natural spring that runs year-round. It would be rough living, especially with winter coming, but it would be defensible and far enough from civilization that we might be able to wait out the immediate pursuit. The plan was risky, requiring them to travel through some of the most treacherous terrain in the Colorado Rockies just as the weather was turning harsh. But it offered something that staying at the cabin could not provide: time and distance to figure out their next move. Christina looked around the small cabin that had briefly represented safety and nodded her agreement. She had learned that safety was always temporary, that survival meant staying one step ahead of those who would destroy you. They worked quickly to gather supplies, taking only what they could carry on their backs while still maintaining the mobility they would need for the difficult journey ahead. Daniel packed his most essential tools, ammunition for his rifle, and enough food to last them several days if they were careful. Christina found clothes among his belongings that would fit her better than her torn dress, practical garments that would provide more protection against the mountain cold. As they prepared to leave, Evans regained enough strength to speak, his voice weak but still carrying venom. "You think you are saving her, mountain man, but you are just delaying the inevitable. The company has resources you cannot imagine, connections that reach all the way to Denver and beyond. They will find you wherever you go, and when they do, they will make you both pay for what you have done here today." Daniel paused in his packing and looked down at the wounded foreman with something approaching pity. "You still do not understand, do you, Evans? This is not about the company or its resources or its connections. This is about right and wrong, about standing up to bullies who think their power gives them the right to abuse those weaker than themselves. You could have let her go, could have found another woman to torment, but you chose to make this personal. Now you have to live with the consequences." Christina stood in the doorway, looking back at the cabin that had sheltered them during the storm of violence. Despite everything that had happened here, she felt a strange sadness at leaving. It was the first place in months where she had felt truly safe, where someone had looked at her with kindness instead of calculation or lust. That feeling was worth more than all the gold in the Colorado mountains. The trail that led away from Daniel's cabin was little more than a game path, winding through dense forest and over rocky outcroppings that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. Daniel led the way, his movements sure and confident despite the heavy pack on his shoulders. Behind him, Christina followed with determined steps, her hand occasionally moving to steady herself against trees or boulders as the path grew steeper and more treacherous. The afternoon sun was already slanting low through the pine branches when they paused for their first rest, finding shelter behind a massive granite boulder that offered concealment from anyone following their trail. Daniel studied the path behind them through a small spyglass, searching for signs of pursuit. The mountain was quiet except for the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant cry of an eagle riding the thermals above the peaks. Christina sat on a fallen log and tried to catch her breath, her hand pressed against her side where a sharp stitch had developed. The baby was active, responding to her elevated heart rate and the unusual exertion. She closed her eyes and tried to project calm, silently apologizing to the life growing inside her for the dangers they faced. This child deserved better than to be born into a world of violence and flight, but she was determined to give it the best chance she could manage. Daniel lowered his spyglass and moved to sit beside her, his expression thoughtful. "They are not following yet," he said quietly. "Either Evans's men are more badly hurt than I thought, or they have decided to wait for reinforcements before coming after us. That gives us some time, but not much. By tomorrow morning, there could be 20 men on our trail, maybe more." Christina looked up at him, studying the weathered face that had become her anchor in a world gone mad. "Who are you, Daniel Jackson? Really, I mean. You live alone on a mountain, you fight like a soldier, and you risk everything to help a stranger. That is not the behavior of an ordinary man." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the distant peaks that rose like cathedral spires against the darkening sky. "I was a soldier once," he said finally, "during the war and after. I saw enough killing to last several lifetimes, enough cruelty to make me want to get as far away from civilization as possible. When my wife died, I came up here looking for peace, for a place where I would not have to choose between my conscience and my survival. Today, I discovered that such a place does not exist. The admission hung between them like a bridge, connecting their separate histories of loss and disillusionment. Christina felt a deep recognition, understanding that they were both refugees from a world that had shown them its worst face. The difference was that Daniel had found a way to preserve his humanity despite everything he had experienced, while she was still learning what that meant. They resumed their climb as the shadows lengthened, following a trail that seemed to exist more in Daniel's memory than in any visible marks on the landscape. The altitude was beginning to affect Christina, her breathing becoming labored as they climbed higher into the thin air of the high country. Daniel noticed her struggle and adjusted their pace, taking more frequent rests and offering encouragement when the path became particularly difficult. As darkness fell, they found shelter in a shallow cave formed by an overhang of granite, a natural windbreak that would hide the light of a small fire from anyone searching below. Daniel gathered dry wood while Christina arranged their sleeping area, using pine boughs to create a barrier against the cold stone floor. The domestic routine felt strange after the violence of the afternoon, a reminder that life continued even in the midst of crisis. The fire cast dancing shadows on the cave walls as they shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, washing it down with water from Daniel's canteen. The silence between them was comfortable now. No longer the awkward quiet of strangers, but the easy companionship of people who had faced danger together and emerged with their trust intact. Christina broke the silence first, her voice soft in the firelit darkness. "What was she like, your wife? You mentioned her earlier, and I could hear something in your voice when you said her name." Daniel poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the cave ceiling. "Sarah was everything good in the world," he said quietly. "Kind, brave, stubborn when she thought she was right. She wanted children, wanted to fill our little house with laughter and noise. We tried for years, but it never happened. Then she got sick, and the doctor said there was nothing to be done. She died in the spring when the wildflowers were blooming and the world was coming back to life. I buried her in the valley below my cabin and swore I would never let anyone else get close enough to hurt me that way again." The pain in his voice was raw, despite the years that had passed, and Christina felt her heart ache for this man who had suffered such loss. She understood now why he had chosen isolation, why he had built his life around solitude and self-sufficiency. Love was a risk that some people could not afford to take twice. "I am sorry," she said simply, "for your loss and for bringing danger into your peaceful life. You could have turned me away, could have let Evans take me back to whatever fate he had planned. Instead, you chose to fight, to risk everything for someone you did not even know. I will never forget that kindness, no matter what happens to us." Daniel looked across the fire at her, seeing in the flickering light a strength that had nothing to do with physical power. She had been beaten, terrorized, hunted through the mountains like an animal, but she had not broken. There was steel in her spine that no amount of abuse could bend, a core of resilience that reminded him of Sarah's quiet courage in the face of her final illness. "What about you?" he asked. "What brought you to Colorado, to that mining camp? You do not talk like someone who grew up in rough country." Christina smiled sadly, her hands moving unconsciously to her belly. "I was a teacher back in Kansas. I had a little school, 20 children from the farming families around our town. I loved that work, loved seeing their faces when they finally understood something that had been puzzling them. Then the drought came, and the families started leaving, and there was no more need for a teacher. I heard there was work in the Colorado mining camps, that they needed people who could read and write to help run the company stores and keep records. It seemed like an adventure, a chance to start over in a new place. The irony was bitter, Daniel realized. She had come west looking for opportunity and independence, only to find herself trapped in a system that treated women as property to be used and discarded. The mining camps were notorious for their treatment of women, but they were often the only places where a woman alone could find work and shelter. It was a devil's bargain that too many women were forced to make. "Evans was not always the way he became with me," Christina continued. "At first, he was almost respectful, even helpful. He made sure I had decent quarters, protected me from some of the rougher men in the camp. I thought he was just being kind, maybe even developing genuine feelings. I was naive enough to believe that his interest in me was romantic rather than possessive. By the time I understood what he really wanted, it was too late to leave without consequences. The fire crackled and popped, sending new shadows dancing across the cave walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, moaning through the rocks with a sound like distant voices. Daniel added another piece of wood to the flames and settled back against his pack, his rifle within easy reach. Even in this remote location, he could not completely relax his vigilance. "When did you realize you were pregnant?" he asked gently. "2 months ago," Christina replied. "I had been feeling sick for weeks, but I thought it was just the stress and the poor food in the camp. When I finally understood what was happening, I was terrified. Evans had been pressuring me to become his woman, making it clear that my Cohen and my safety depended on my cooperation. When he found out about the baby, he assumed it was his and started talking about how we would be married and I would move into his house. The assumption that I belonged to him, that my body and my child were his property, that was when I knew I had to get away, no matter what it cost." Daniel felt a cold anger building in his chest as he listened to her story, the familiar rage that came when he encountered the casual cruelty that some men inflicted on those weaker than themselves. He had seen it during the war, the way some soldiers treated civilians, and he had seen it after, in the mining camps and frontier towns where might made right and the law was whatever the strongest man said it was. "The baby," he said carefully, "is it his?" Christina was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if searching for answers in the dancing flames. "I do not know," she said finally. "There was a night about 6 months ago when he came to my room. He had been drinking and he would not take no for an answer. I fought him, but he was stronger, and there was nowhere to run. Afterward, he acted like nothing had happened, like it was just something he was entitled to. But there was also someone else, a good man who worked in the mine. We cared for each other, spent time together when we could manage it secretly. The timing could go either way." Daniel nodded, understanding the complexity of her situation. In the world they lived in, the question of paternity could mean the difference between freedom and slavery, between a child born into love and one claimed by a violent man who saw it as proof of ownership. The uncertainty must have been eating at her for months. "It does not matter," he said firmly. "Whatever the truth is, that child deserves better than to be raised by a man like Evans. A child needs love and protection, not a father who sees it as a possession to be controlled." Christina looked at him with surprise, then with something deeper that made her eyes shine in the firelight. "You mean that, do not you? You really believe that it does not matter who the father is?" Daniel met her gaze steadily. "I believe that we choose our families," he said. "Biology is just an accident of nature. What matters is who loves the child, who protects it, who teaches it right from wrong. A man who would beat a pregnant woman has already disqualified himself from fatherhood, regardless of what his blood might have contributed." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge directly. But Christina felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the fear and shame that had been her constant companions for months. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she began to imagine a future where her child might be wanted and loved, where it might grow up free from the violence that had marked its conception. They settled down to sleep as the fire burned low, Daniel taking the first watch while Christina curled up in her blankets near the cave wall. The baby was quiet now, lulled by her steady heartbeat and the warmth of the fire. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine what their destination might be like, the abandoned mine that would be their refuge from the pursuing storm. Daniel sat with his back against the cave entrance, his rifle across his knees, listening to the night sounds of the mountain. Somewhere below them, men were probably planning their pursuit, organizing resources and manpower for the hunt that would begin with the dawn. But for now, in this moment, they were safe. Christina was sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, and the child she carried was protected by more than just her courage. The stars were brilliant in the thin air above the peaks, a reminder that there were forces in the universe larger than human cruelty and greed. Daniel had lost his faith in many things over the years, but he had never stopped believing that the mountains themselves were on the side of justice, that they offered sanctuary to those who respected their power and understood their moods. As the night deepened, Daniel found himself thinking about the future in ways he had not allowed himself to consider for years. The woman sleeping beside him had awakened something in him that he had thought safely buried with his wife, a desire to protect and provide that went beyond simple human decency. The child she carried represented hope in a world that had shown him mostly despair, a chance for a new life to emerge from the ashes of old pain. But the morning would bring new challenges, new dangers that would test every skill he had learned in his years of mountain living. Evans and his employers would not give up easily, and the resources they could bring to bear were formidable. The territorial authorities, such as they were, would likely side with the mining company over a pregnant woman and the hermit who had chosen to protect her. They would be branded as outlaws, fugitives from justice, their story twisted to serve the needs of those in power. Daniel shifted his position and checked his pocket watch by starlight. 2 more hours until he would wake Christina for her turn at watch. The altitude and the stress of their flight had exhausted her more than she wanted to admit, and he was reluctant to disturb her rest. The baby she carried would need all her strength in the days to come, and he was determined to see that both of them had every possible chance to survive what lay ahead. A sound from below caught his attention, the distant crack of a breaking branch that might have been caused by wind, but could also indicate human movement. Daniel tensed, his grip tightening on his rifle as he strained to hear more. The mountain was full of night sounds, the normal chorus of nocturnal creatures going about their business. But there was something different in the air tonight, a tension that made his skin crawl with anticipation. Another sound, closer this time, the scrape of boot leather against stone. Daniel's blood ran cold as he realized what it meant. Somehow, against all odds, Evans' men had followed their trail in the darkness, tracking them up the treacherous mountain path with a skill that spoke of professional hunters or military training. The mining companies had resources he had not fully appreciated, connections that could bring experienced trackers into the game. He reached over and gently shook Christina awake, his hand covering her mouth to prevent any sound that might give away their position. Her eyes opened immediately, alert and focused despite having been deep in sleep moments before. She had learned to wake ready for danger, a skill that no pregnant woman should have needed to develop. "They are here," Daniel whispered, his lips close to her ear. "At least 3 men, maybe more, coming up the trail below us. We need to move now before they can surround this position." Christina nodded and began gathering their gear with swift, silent efficiency. The baby kicked inside her as if sensing the renewed danger, and she pressed her hand against her belly in a gesture of reassurance. They had hoped for a full night's rest before continuing their flight, but the mountain had other plans. Survival meant adapting to circumstances beyond their control, accepting that safety was always temporary and peace always fragile. Daniel shouldered his pack and helped Christina to her feet, noting with concern how the rapid movement made her sway slightly. The altitude and stress were taking their toll, but there was no choice except to push forward. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing closer, the careful footsteps of men who knew their business and were confident in their ability to run their quarry to ground. They slipped out of the cave like shadows, following a narrow ledge that led around the side of the mountain toward a series of switchbacks that would take them higher into the peaks. The path was treacherous in daylight and potentially deadly in darkness, but it offered their only chance of escape. Below them, the lights of torches began to flicker through the trees, revealing just how close their pursuers had come to discovering their hiding place. The hunt was beginning in earnest now, and Daniel knew that everything depended on reaching the abandoned mine before their enemies could organize a proper siege. The next 24 hours would determine whether they found sanctuary or whether Christina's story would end in the same violence that had marked its beginning. As they climbed higher into the thin air and bitter cold of the high country, Daniel made a silent promise to the woman beside him and the child she carried. Whatever the risk, he would see them both to safety or die in the attempt. The mountain wind carried the sound of voices behind them, harsh and urgent, the calls of hunters who had found their trail and were closing in for the kill. The narrow ledge carved into the mountainside barely offered enough room for single-file passage, and in the darkness it felt like walking on the edge of eternity. Christina pressed herself against the cold granite wall, her fingers searching for handholds as loose stones scattered beneath her feet and tumbled into the black void below. The baby shifted restlessly inside her, responding to her elevated heart rate and the thin air that made every breath a conscious effort. Daniel moved ahead of her with the sure-footed confidence of a man who knew these peaks intimately, but even he was forced to slow their pace as the path grew more treacherous. Behind them, the torchlight of their pursuers flickered through the trees like malevolent stars, close enough that they could occasionally hear voices carried on the mountain wind. The hunters were being more careful now, aware that their quarry was armed and dangerous, but they were still coming with the relentless patience of men who knew they held most of the advantages. The trail curved around a massive granite outcropping, and Daniel paused to help Christina navigate a particularly difficult section where the ledge narrowed to less than 2 feet wide. His hands were steady and strong as he guided her across, but she could feel the tension in his grip, the awareness that one misstep would send them both plummeting into the darkness below. The mountain demanded respect, and it punished carelessness with swift and final judgment. As they rounded the outcropping, the abandoned mine came into view for the first time, a cluster of weathered buildings clinging to a shelf of rock 500 feet above them. Even in the darkness, Christina could see that it was larger than she had expected. With what looked like a main shaft house, several smaller structures, and the skeletal remains of a wooden headframe that had once hauled ore from the depths of the mountain. It was a ghost town suspended between earth and sky, a monument to human ambition and the inevitable triumph of nature over industry. The sight of their destination gave Christina new strength, but Daniel's expression remained grim as he studied the terrain between their current position and the mine buildings. The path ahead was exposed for long stretches, offering little cover from anyone with a rifle and good shooting skills. They would be vulnerable during the final approach, silhouetted against the lighter sky as they climbed toward sanctuary. A rifle shot cracked through the night air, the bullet striking the granite wall just inches from Daniel's head and sending rock fragments showering down on them both. Christina instinctively pressed herself closer to the mountain face, her arms wrapping protectively around her belly as more shots followed in rapid succession. Their pursuers had found the range, and the narrow ledge that had been their salvation was now becoming their trap. Daniel returned fire, his Winchester barking 3 times in quick succession as he aimed at the muzzle flashes below. One of his shots drew a scream of pain that echoed off the canyon walls, but the others kept firing, their bullets chipping away at the stone around them with methodical precision. They were good shots, these hunters, probably men with military experience who understood the geometry of mountain warfare. "We have to move," Daniel called over the sound of gunfire. "They have us pinned down here, and it is only a matter of time before they find the angle to finish us. Stay low and follow my lead. When I say run, you run and do not look back, no matter what happens." Christina nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs as she prepared herself for what might be the most dangerous minutes of her life. The baby was moving frantically now, as if sensing the mortal peril that surrounded them. She whispered a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening, asking not for her own safety, but for the chance to bring this innocent life safely into the world. Daniel waited for a lull in the shooting, then grabbed Christina's hand and pulled her forward along the ledge. They moved as quickly as the treacherous footing would allow, half running and half climbing as bullets whined through the air around them. The shooters below were trying to lead their targets, anticipating their movement, but the irregular terrain made accurate shooting nearly impossible in the darkness. A section of the ledge gave way beneath Christina's feet, and she would have fallen if not for Daniel's iron grip on her wrist. For a terrifying moment, she hung suspended over the abyss, her legs kicking frantically as loose rock tumbled into the darkness below. Daniel hauled her back onto solid ground with strength born of desperation, his face grim with the knowledge of how close they had come to disaster. The shooting had stopped, but Christina could hear voices calling to each other in the darkness below, the sound of men regrouping and planning their next move. They had lost the element of surprise, but they still had numbers and better equipment. More importantly, they had the backing of an organization with deep pockets and long reach, while Daniel and Christina had only their courage and the uncertain sanctuary of an abandoned mine. The final approach to the mine buildings required them to cross an open slope where the original miners had carved switchbacks into the mountainside. There was no cover here, nothing to shield them from rifle fire except speed and the darkness that was already beginning to fade as dawn approached. Daniel studied the terrain with the eye of a soldier, calculating angles and distances, weighing risks against the certainty of being trapped on the ledge if they waited much longer. The first rays of sunlight were touching the eastern peaks when they made their dash for the mine. Running up the exposed switchbacks, while bullets kicked up dust around their feet. Christina's breath came in ragged gasps as the altitude and exertion pushed her body to its limits. But she forced herself to keep moving, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death for both her and her unborn child. They reached the first building, an old assay office with boarded windows and a sagging roof, just as the sun crested the ridge behind them. Daniel kicked in the door and pulled Christina inside, both of them collapsing against the far wall as they struggled to catch their breath. The interior was thick with dust and the smell of abandonment, but it offered blessed shelter from the rifle fire that had followed them up the mountain. Daniel moved to one of the windows and peered through a gap in the boards, studying the terrain below. Their pursuers had spread out during the climb, and he could see at least 5 men positioned at various points around the mine complex. They were being systematic about it, establishing fields of fire that would cover all the possible escape routes. These were not the amateur bounty hunters he had hoped to face, but professional gun hands who understood siege warfare. Christina sank into a chair that had somehow survived the years of abandonment, her hands pressed against her belly as she tried to calm the frantic movements of the baby inside her. The stress and exertion were taking their toll, and she could feel a cramping sensation that made her fear for the child's safety. She had come so far, endured so much, only to face the possibility of losing everything just as sanctuary seemed within reach. The building they had chosen for shelter was part of a larger complex that included the main shaft house, a bunkhouse where the miners had lived, and several smaller structures whose original purposes were no longer clear. Daniel began moving through the connected buildings, checking for other entrances and exits, evaluating their defensive positions. The mine had been built to last, with thick stone walls and heavy timber construction that would stop most rifle bullets. In the main shaft house, Daniel discovered something that made him smile grimly. The miners had left behind a substantial cache of black powder and mining equipment, including enough dynamite to bring down half the mountain if used properly. It was old and potentially unstable, but it represented a significant equalizer in their current situation. Men who were willing to storm a defended position might think twice if they knew their targets had access to high explosives. Christina joined him in the shaft house, moving carefully through the maze of abandoned machinery and supplies. The sight of the mining equipment brought back memories of the camp where her troubles had begun, but she pushed those thoughts aside and focused on their current predicament. The baby had quieted somewhat, perhaps responding to her efforts to remain calm, but she could still feel the occasional flutter of movement that reminded her of what was at stake. Daniel was examining the dynamite when a voice called out from somewhere below the mine complex, amplified by a speaking trumpet that made it carry clearly through the thin mountain air. The voice belonged to a man Christina did not recognize, someone with the crisp diction of education and authority. This was not Thomas Evans or any of his rough companions, but someone new, someone whose presence changed the nature of their situation entirely. "You in the mine, this is Ryan Morgan, Territorial Marshal. You are harboring a fugitive from justice and interfering with a lawful arrest. Surrender the woman now, and you will be treated fairly under territorial law. Continue to resist, and you will be charged as an accessory to theft and assault. You have 1 hour to consider your options." Daniel moved to a window where he could see the speaker, a tall man in a dark coat who stood well back from the mine buildings, flanked by several armed deputies. The arrival of territorial law enforcement changed everything, transforming their flight from a private dispute into a confrontation with official authority. Even if they managed to escape this immediate situation, they would now be wanted by the law itself, marked as fugitives with prices on their heads. Christina felt her heart sink as the implications became clear. Thomas Evans had managed to involve the territorial authorities, probably with a carefully crafted story that had painted her as a criminal and Daniel as her accomplice. The mining companies had influence that reached far beyond their immediate operations, connections with politicians and lawmen who could be counted on to support their version of events. Her word against theirs would carry no weight in any court of law. Daniel studied the marshal through his spyglass, noting the man's confident bearing and the professional way his deputies had positioned themselves. These were not the hired thugs Evans had sent initially, but legitimate law enforcement officers who believed they were doing their duty. That made them more dangerous in some ways, because they would not be easily intimidated or bought off, but it also meant they might be reasoned with if the right approach could be found. The marshal called out again, his voice carrying the patient authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Miss Alvarez, I know you can hear me. You have been accused of stealing company funds and assaulting a mine supervisor. These are serious charges that require you to answer in a court of law. Come out now and you will be treated with all the consideration due to your condition. Continue to resist and you force us to use methods that might endanger both you and your unborn child. Christina moved to the window beside Daniel, her face pale but determined as she studied the men arrayed against them. She recognized the careful phrasing of the marshal's words, the way he had avoided mentioning the specific nature of Evan's accusations while making it clear that official charges had been filed. It was a masterful piece of legal manipulation, designed to make her seem unreasonable if she continued to resist what appeared to be lawful authority. Daniel's mind was working furiously as he tried to find a way out of their increasingly desperate situation. The arrival of the territorial marshal had eliminated most of their options, but it had also revealed something important about their enemies. Evans and his employers were not content to handle this matter privately, which suggested they were more afraid of Christina's story than they wanted to admit. The involvement of official law enforcement was meant to legitimize their pursuit, but it also meant they were playing by rules that might be turned against them. He turned to Christina, his voice low and urgent, as he outlined the possibility that had occurred to him. The marshal said you were accused of theft and assault, but he did not mention anything about the real reason Evans wants you back. That suggests the official complaint does not include the whole truth about what happened at the mining camp. If we can get your story heard by someone in authority who is not already in Evans's pocket, we might be able to turn this situation around. Christina shook her head, her expression bitter with the knowledge of how the world really worked for women in her position. Who would believe me, Daniel? A pregnant woman with no family, no connections, no money for lawyers, against a mine foreman with the backing of a major company and the territorial authorities already convinced of his version of events. Even if I could prove what he did to me, they would say I was asking for it, that I led him on and then cried assault when things did not go my way. The harsh truth of her words hung between them like a physical weight, a reminder of the fundamental inequalities that shaped life in the territorial West. Women like Christina existed at the mercy of men like Evans, with little legal protection and even less social support when things went wrong. The law was supposed to protect the innocent, but in practice it most often served those with the power to manipulate it to their advantage. Daniel was about to respond when the crack of a rifle shot echoed across the mine complex, followed by the sound of splintering wood as a bullet punched through the wall just feet from where they stood. The marshal's hour of grace had apparently been shortened by someone with less patience for negotiation. Daniel grabbed Christina and pulled her away from the window as more shots followed, the methodical fire of men who were probing for weaknesses in their defenses. Through the chaos of gunfire, Daniel could hear voices calling out orders, the sound of men moving into position around the mine buildings. The siege had begun in earnest now, and their enemies were no longer content to wait for surrender. The territorial marshal might prefer to take them alive, but the men he had brought with him were clearly prepared to use whatever force was necessary to end the standoff. Christina pressed herself against the stone wall, her hands protectively covering her belly as bullets whined overhead. The baby was moving frantically again, responding to the stress hormones flooding her system. She closed her eyes and tried to project calm toward the life growing inside her, silently promising that she would find a way to keep them both alive no matter what it took. Daniel moved through the mine buildings with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to fight in confined spaces, checking their defenses and looking for tactical advantages. The stone construction of the main buildings would stop rifle bullets, but there were too many windows and doorways to cover effectively with just two people. They needed to consolidate their position, find a defensible space where they could make their stand with some hope of survival. The main shaft house offered the best possibilities, with its thick walls and limited access points. Daniel began moving their supplies there, including the cache of dynamite he had discovered earlier. The explosives were old and potentially unstable, but they represented their best hope of evening the odds against superior numbers. If their enemies wanted to storm the building, they would pay a heavy price for the privilege. Christina helped as much as her condition allowed, moving carefully through the maze of abandoned equipment while staying away from the windows where sniper fire might find her. The physical activity helped calm her nerves, giving her something to focus on besides the growing sounds of their enemies tightening the noose around them. She had learned during her flight from the mining camp that action was better than helpless waiting when death was stalking close behind. The shooting intensified as their pursuers tested different angles of attack, probing for weak points in the mine's defenses. Daniel returned fire when he could, but he was careful to conserve ammunition and avoid revealing all of their positions. The men outside had superior numbers and firepower, but they were operating in unfamiliar territory, while Daniel had the advantage of defensive positions and intimate knowledge of the mine complex. As the morning wore on, it became clear that their enemies were settling in for a prolonged siege rather than risking the casualties that would come from a direct assault. Daniel could see men taking positions behind cover, establishing fields of fire that would make movement between buildings nearly impossible. They were being methodical about it, professional in their approach, which suggested military training and experience with this type of operation. The territorial marshal called out again, his voice carrying the patient authority of a man who believed time was on his side. "You cannot hold out indefinitely up there. We have supplies and reinforcements coming while you have nowhere to run and limited resources. Be reasonable about this. Surrender now and avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Think about that child you are carrying, Miss Alvarez. Is your pride worth risking its life?" Christina felt the words hit her like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to exploit her deepest fears and vulnerabilities. The marshal was right about one thing. They could not hold out indefinitely against superior numbers and resources. But surrender meant returning to Evans's control, accepting a fate that might be worse than death for both her and her child. The choice was between certain doom and the slim possibility of escape, between submission and the chance to fight for something better. Daniel was studying the terrain around the mine complex when he noticed something that made him pause. The original miners had carved their operations into a natural amphitheater of rock, with the main buildings positioned on a shelf that overlooked the approach routes. But behind the mine, the mountain rose in a series of broken ridges and hidden valleys that might offer escape routes invisible from below. It would be a desperate gamble, requiring them to abandon the relative safety of the buildings for the uncertain protection of the high country, but it might be their only chance. He explained his observations to Christina, pointing out the possible routes through the rock formations that rose behind the mine. The paths would be treacherous, especially for someone in her condition, but they offered something that staying in the buildings could not provide: the possibility of breaking free from the siege before their enemies could bring up the heavy weapons that would make their position untenable. Christina studied the terrain he was indicating, her mind calculating the risks and possibilities with the clear-eyed pragmatism that had kept her alive during her flight from the mining camp. The routes Daniel had identified were barely visible, little more than game trails that wound through broken country where a single misstep could prove fatal. But they led away from their enemies, toward the high peaks where pursuit would be difficult and detection nearly impossible. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, as if offering its own opinion on their situation. Christina pressed her hand against the spot and felt a flutter of movement that seemed almost like encouragement. This child had already survived more than most people faced in a lifetime, and it deserved the chance to be born free rather than in captivity to a man who saw it as property to be claimed. Daniel was preparing their escape route when the sound of approaching horses echoed up from the valley below, the steady rhythm of multiple animals moving at a controlled pace. He moved to a window and used his spyglass to study the new arrivals, counting at least 8 mounted men who were clearly reinforcements for the siege. The territorial marshal had not been bluffing about additional resources, and their situation was about to become significantly more desperate. The new arrivals included several men that Daniel recognized from his years of solitary observation of the valley settlements. Roy Lee, Baishe Lee, a notorious gun hand who hired out to mining companies and cattle barons when they needed problems solved with violence. Timothy Reyes, a former Army scout who had turned his tracking skills to bounty hunting after the Indian Wars ended. These were not ordinary lawmen doing their duty, but specialists in violence who had been brought in to ensure that the siege ended quickly and decisively. Christina saw the change in Daniel's expression and knew without being told that their situation had taken a turn for the worse. The arrival of reinforcements meant that any hope of outlasting the siege was now gone, that they would have to act quickly if they were going to act at all. The escape route through the high country was looking less like a desperate gamble and more like their only realistic option for survival. Daniel began gathering the supplies they would need for the journey, selecting only the most essential items that they could carry without being slowed down by excess weight. The dynamite presented a particular challenge, dangerous to transport, but potentially invaluable if they needed to discourage pursuit or clear obstacles from their path. He carefully wrapped several sticks in cloth and secured them in his pack, handling the old explosives with the respect their instability demanded. The sound of gunfire intensified as their enemies began a more aggressive probing of the mine's defenses, testing different approaches, and looking for weaknesses they could exploit. Daniel could hear orders being shouted, the coordination of men who were preparing for a final assault. Time was running out faster than he had hoped, and they would have to move soon or risk being trapped in the buildings when the real attack began. Christina was checking her own pack when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the unmistakable voice of Thomas Evans calling out from somewhere below the mine. She had hoped never to hear that voice again, had tried to convince herself that his injuries might have kept him from joining the pursuit. But he was here now, close enough that she could make out the words of hatred and possession that he was shouting toward the mine buildings. "You cannot hide from me forever, Christina," Evans called, his voice carrying the obsessive fury of a man who had been denied something he considered rightfully his. "I know you are up there, listening to me, thinking you can escape what you owe me. But you belong to me now, girl, you and that bastard child you are carrying. I will have you back, and when I do, I will teach you what happens to women who try to run from their obligations." The words hit Christina like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to exploit her deepest fears and vulnerabilities. But instead of the terror she had expected to feel, she found herself filled with a cold rage that surprised her with its intensity. She had run far enough, hidden long enough, allowed this man's threats to control her life for too many months. The time had come to stop running and start fighting back with everything she had. Daniel saw the change in her expression and recognized the look of someone who had reached their breaking point. It was the same expression he had seen in the mirror after his wife's death, when he had decided to leave civilization behind and seek solitude in the mountains. Christina had found her own version of that moment. The instant when fear transformed into determination and survival became a matter of will rather than luck. The escape route Daniel had identified led through a narrow gap in the rock formations behind the mine, a natural passage that the original miners had probably used to access the higher elevations where they had found the silver veins that justified their operations. The path was treacherous and partly concealed, invisible from the positions their enemies had taken around the mine complex. If they could reach it undetected, they might have a chance of breaking free before pursuit could be organized. Daniel rigged the remaining dynamite with a long fuse, creating a diversion that would hopefully draw attention away from their escape route, while making their enemies think twice about storming the buildings. The explosion would be visible for miles, but it would also create enough chaos and confusion to cover their movements during the critical first minutes of their flight. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation was becoming their most reliable ally. Christina gathered the few personal items she had managed to salvage from her flight, including a small silver locket that had belonged to her mother and a worn Bible that had provided comfort during the darkest moments of her journey. These things had no practical value in their current situation, but they represented connections to a life and identity that Thomas Evans and his kind could never touch or destroy. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the mine building as their enemies began moving closer, testing the defenses in preparation for what would probably be their final assault. Daniel could hear orders being given, the coordination of men who were confident in their superior numbers and firepower. The siege was entering its final phase, and they would have to move within the next few minutes or risk being trapped when the real attack began. Daniel lit the fuse and grabbed Christina's hand, pulling her toward the back of the mine complex where their escape route waited. Behind them, the dynamite burned with a steady hiss that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space of the shaft house. They had perhaps 3 minutes before the explosion, 3 minutes to reach safety before their enemies realized what was happening and organized pursuit. The path through the rock formations was even more treacherous than it had appeared from a distance, requiring them to squeeze through gaps barely wide enough for a single person and climb over boulders that shifted ominously under their weight. Christina's pregnancy made every movement more difficult, but she forced herself to keep up with Daniel's pace, driven by the knowledge that falling behind meant capture and everything that would follow. The explosion, when it came, was louder than either of them had expected. A thunderous roar that echoed off the canyon walls and sent a pillar of smoke and debris rising into the morning sky. The blast shattered windows in the remaining mine buildings and triggered a small avalanche on the slope below, creating exactly the kind of chaos and confusion Daniel had hoped for. Shouts of alarm rose from their enemies' positions as men scrambled to understand what had happened and whether it represented a new threat to their safety. The diversion bought them precious time as they climbed higher into the broken country behind the mine, following game trails that wound through a maze of granite spires and hidden valleys. The terrain was challenging even for experienced mountaineers, requiring careful route finding and constant attention to the stability of the rock formations they were traversing. One wrong step could trigger a rock slide that would reveal their position to anyone watching from below. Christina's breathing was labored as the altitude and exertion pushed her body to its limits, but she refused to slow their pace despite the cramping sensation that had returned to her abdomen. The baby was moving frantically, responding to the stress hormones flooding her system, and she could feel a wetness between her legs that might have been sweat or something more alarming. The thought of losing the child now, after everything they had endured to reach this point, was almost unbearable. Daniel noticed her distress and called for a brief rest in the shelter of a massive boulder that offered concealment from observers below. Christina sank gratefully to the ground, her hand pressed against her belly as she tried to calm the frantic movements of the baby inside her. The cramping was getting worse, coming in waves that made her fear she might be going into premature labor, brought on by the stress and physical demands of their flight. Below them, they could hear the sounds of organized pursuit beginning, the calls of men spreading out to search for their trail. The explosion had bought them time, but it had also revealed that they were no longer in the mine buildings, that they had somehow managed to escape the siege that their enemies had thought was foolproof. The hunt was beginning again, but this time in terrain that favored the hunted rather than the hunters. Daniel used his spyglass to study the search pattern developing below, noting with satisfaction that their enemies were focusing their efforts in the wrong direction. The natural assumption would be that they had tried to descend toward the valley floor, following the easier routes that offered faster travel and better concealment. The idea that they had climbed higher into the most treacherous country would seem unlikely to men who did not understand the mountain's moods and possibilities. Christina felt the cramping ease slightly and forced herself to stand, determined not to be the weakness that led to their capture. The baby had quieted somewhat, perhaps responding to her efforts to remain calm, but she could still feel occasional movements that reminded her of what was at stake. This child deserved the chance to be born free, to grow up without the shadow of Thomas Evans's obsession hanging over its future. The trail ahead led through a series of switchbacks that would take them over a high ridge and into a hidden valley that Daniel remembered from his early explorations of the area. It was a place where few men had ever set foot, a sanctuary protected by the mountain itself from the ambitions and cruelties of the outside world. If they could reach it, they would have time to rest and plan their next move while their enemies exhausted themselves searching the lower elevations. The climb to the ridge was the most challenging part of their journey so far, requiring them to use handholds carved by wind and weather into the granite face of the mountain. Christina's pregnancy made the ascent especially difficult, but she attacked each obstacle with grim determination, refusing to let her condition become an excuse for failure. The baby seemed to sense her resolve, becoming quieter and more settled as they climbed higher into the thin air. Daniel stayed close behind her, ready to provide assistance if she faltered, but impressed by her strength and determination. She had transformed during their flight from a frightened victim into someone who could face any challenge with courage and resourcefulness. The mountains had a way of revealing people's true character, stripping away pretense and social conditioning to expose the essential core of who they really were. As they neared the crest of the ridge, the sound of pursuit faded to a distant murmur, the voices of their enemies growing fainter as the searchers spread out through the lower elevations. The tactical advantage was shifting in their favor now, as the hunters became scattered and disorganized while the hunted moved with purpose toward a specific destination. The mountain was beginning to work its ancient magic, protecting those who understood its moods, while confusing and frustrating those who tried to impose their will upon it. The hidden valley that opened before them as they crested the ridge was everything Daniel had remembered and more. A natural amphitheater surrounded by towering peaks, with a crystal-clear stream running through meadows that still held patches of late summer wildflowers despite the approaching winter. It was a place that seemed untouched by human ambition, a sanctuary where the only sounds were wind and water and the distant cry of eagles riding the thermals above the peaks. Christina stood at the edge of the valley and felt tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the beauty and peace of the place after the violence and terror of the past few days. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she could imagine a future where her child might grow up surrounded by wonder rather than cruelty, where it might learn to love the natural world instead of fearing the human one. Daniel watched her reaction with understanding, remembering his own first glimpse of this hidden paradise during the dark days after his wife's death. The valley had offered him healing when he thought his heart was too broken to mend, and perhaps it could do the same for Christina and the new life she carried. But first, they had to survive long enough to claim the sanctuary it offered, and their enemies were still searching for them with the persistence of men who had too much invested in the outcome to give up easily. The descent into the valley was easier than the climb to the ridge, following a natural path that wound between stands of aspen and pine toward the meadows beside the stream. Christina felt her strength returning as they moved into the sheltered environment, the baby settling into a more peaceful rhythm that suggested it too was responding to the change from chaos to tranquility. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that everything might somehow work out, that they might find a way to build something good from the ashes of their separate tragedies. But even as they descended toward the promise of temporary safety, the sound of distant gunshots echoed across the peaks, a reminder that their enemies had not given up the hunt. The valley might offer sanctuary, but it was not a permanent solution to the forces arrayed against them. Sooner or later, they would have to face the reality of their situation and find a way to end the pursuit that had driven them into the high country. The mountain could protect them for a while, but ultimately their survival would depend on their own courage and resourcefulness. As they reached the floor of the valley and made camp beside the stream, Daniel and Christina both understood that they had reached a turning point in their flight. The next phase of their struggle would require different tactics, different strategies, and perhaps most importantly, different allies. The mountain had given them breathing space, but the real battle for their future was just beginning. The hidden valley embraced them like a sanctuary carved from the very heart of the mountain, its crystal waters reflecting the golden light of late afternoon as Daniel and Christina made their temporary camp beside the stream. The baby had finally settled into a peaceful rhythm, no longer responding to the constant stress that had marked their desperate flight through the high country. Christina pressed her hand against her belly and felt a gentle flutter of movement, as if the child itself recognized that they had found momentary safety in this place, untouched by human cruelty. Daniel moved with quiet efficiency as he gathered dry wood for a small fire, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines above them for any sign of pursuit. The valley offered excellent concealment, but he knew their enemies would not give up easily. Men like Thomas Evans and the territorial marshal who backed him had too much invested in maintaining their authority to let this challenge go unanswered. The explosion at the mine would have bought them time, but it would also have revealed their resourcefulness and determination, making their eventual capture even more important to those who hunted them. The stream that ran through the valley was fed by snowmelt from the peaks above, its water so pure and cold that it seemed to wash away the dust and fear that had accumulated during their harrowing journey. Christina knelt beside the water and cupped her hands, drinking deeply before splashing her face with the icy liquid. The bruises Evans had left on her skin were beginning to fade, but she could still feel the phantom pain of his fists whenever she moved too quickly or turned her head at the wrong angle. As darkness settled over the valley, Daniel built their fire in a natural depression that would hide its glow from observers on the surrounding ridges. The flames cast dancing shadows on the granite walls that enclosed their sanctuary, creating an intimate space that felt almost like a room carved from living stone. Christina sat close to the fire, her hands extended toward its warmth as she tried to process everything that had happened since she first stumbled into Daniel's clearing 3 days ago. It felt like a lifetime had passed since that moment when she had emerged from the forest like a wounded animal seeking shelter. The frightened, beaten woman who had collapsed on Daniel's porch seemed like a stranger now, someone whose desperation and helplessness belonged to a different person entirely. The trials of their flight had awakened something fierce inside her, a strength she had not known she possessed until circumstances forced her to discover it. Daniel watched her face in the firelight and saw the transformation that had taken place during their journey together. The fear was still there, would probably always be there to some degree, but it no longer dominated her expression. Instead, he saw determination, resilience, and something else that made his chest tight with emotions he had thought safely buried with his wife. Christina had become someone worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth building a future with, if such a thing were possible. The sound of distant voices carried on the night wind, faint but unmistakable. The calls of searchers working their way through the lower elevations. Daniel tensed and reached for his rifle, but the voices were too far away to represent an immediate threat. Their enemies were still looking in the wrong places, following false trails and wasting energy on routes that led nowhere. The mountain was protecting them for now, but Daniel knew that protection would not last forever. Christina heard the voices too, and felt her heart rate spike with the familiar fear that had been her constant companion for so many months. But this time the fear was tempered by something new, a confidence born from surviving challenges that should have destroyed her. She had faced Thomas Evans' violence and escaped. She had climbed treacherous mountain paths while carrying new life inside her. She had helped fight off armed men and lived to see another day. Whatever came next, she would face it with her eyes open and her spine straight. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, as if reminding her that she was not alone in this struggle. Christina smiled and pressed both hands against her belly, feeling the solid reality of the life growing inside her. This child had already survived more than most people faced in a lifetime, and it deserved the chance to be born free from the shadows of its violent conception. Whatever Thomas Evans might claim about paternity, this baby belonged to her and to the future she was determined to build for both of them. Daniel added another piece of wood to the fire and settled back against his pack, his rifle across his knees in a position that allowed for quick action if needed. The valley was as secure as any place they were likely to find in these mountains, but he could not allow himself to relax completely while their enemies were still searching. Sleep would come in shifts, with one of them always alert and ready to respond to any threat that might emerge from the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. The conversation that developed between them as the night deepened was unlike anything either had experienced before, a sharing of histories and hopes that went beyond the desperate circumstances that had brought them together. Christina spoke of her childhood in Kansas, of the little schoolhouse where she had taught before drought and economic hardship had driven her west in search of new opportunities. Daniel told her about his years as a soldier, about the battles that had shaped him and the peace he had sought in these mountains after losing everything that mattered to him. They talked about Sarah, Daniel's wife, and the dreams they had shared before illness took her away. Christina listened with the quiet attention of someone who understood loss, who had experienced her own version of having the future stolen by forces beyond her control. The mining camp had represented her attempt to start over, to build something meaningful from the ruins of her former life, only to discover that some forms of captivity were more subtle and more dangerous than others. The fire burned lower as they shared their stories, creating an intimacy that had nothing to do with physical proximity and everything to do with the recognition of kindred spirits who had survived their separate ordeals with their humanity intact. Daniel found himself speaking of things he had never told another living soul, memories and feelings that he had thought too painful to share. Christina responded with her own revelations, admissions of fear and hope that she had never dared voice even to herself. When the subject of the baby's paternity arose, it was Christina who brought it up, her voice steady despite the complexity of emotions the topic stirred. She told Daniel about the night Evans had forced himself on her, about the violence and humiliation that had left her feeling broken and worthless. But she also spoke of Robert Martinez, the gentle miner who had shown her kindness and respect during the brief time they had been able to spend together before Evans's jealousy made their relationship impossible to continue. Daniel listened without judgment, understanding that the truth of the child's parentage was less important than the love and protection it would receive from the woman who carried it. Biology was an accident of nature, but family was a choice made by people who cared enough to commit themselves to each other's welfare. If Christina would have him, he was prepared to be a father to her child regardless of whose blood it might carry, to provide the stability and security that every child deserved. The offer was made quietly, without dramatics or elaborate declarations, just a simple statement of intent from a man who had learned to value substance over sentiment. Christina felt tears streaming down her face as she absorbed the magnitude of what he was proposing. The willingness to take on responsibilities that were not his own for no reason other than love and basic human decency. It was the kind of generosity she had stopped believing existed in the world, a reminder that not all men were driven by the need to possess and control. As the night wore on, they took turns keeping watch while the others slept, a practical arrangement that also allowed each of them to process the emotional revelations that had passed between them. Daniel found himself studying Christina's sleeping face in the firelight, noting the way the harsh lines of stress and fear had softened now that she felt truly safe for the first time in months. The transformation was remarkable, revealing the natural beauty that had been hidden beneath layers of trauma and exhaustion. Christina's dreams were peaceful for the first time since discovering her pregnancy, filled with images of sunlit meadows and laughing children rather than the nightmares of pursuit and violence that had plagued her sleep for so long. The baby moved gently inside her, responding to her relaxed state with its own version of contentment. Even in sleep, she kept one hand pressed protectively against her belly, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing during the long months of carrying this precious burden. Dawn came slowly to the hidden valley, the sun's first rays painting the granite peaks in shades of gold and rose that seemed to transform the entire landscape into something from a fairy tale. Daniel woke to find Christina already stirring, her hand moving in slow circles over her belly as she communicated with the life growing inside her. The sight filled him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire that still glowed between them, a sense of rightness that he had not felt since Sarah's death. The morning brought practical concerns that could no longer be ignored. Their supplies were running low, and Christina's condition required better nutrition and more stable shelter than they could provide while living as fugitives in the high country. The hidden valley was a perfect sanctuary for a brief respite, but it could not serve as a permanent solution to their problems. They needed allies, resources, and most importantly, a way to neutralize the threat that Thomas Evans and his backers represented. Daniel had been thinking about their options during his watch, and he had reached a conclusion that surprised him with its simplicity. The territorial marshal who had joined the hunt was operating under false information, led to believe that Christina was a criminal fleeing justice rather than a victim escaping her abuser. If they could find a way to present their side of the story to someone in authority who was not already corrupted by mining company influence, they might be able to turn the legal system to their advantage rather than continuing to run from it. The challenge lay in finding such a person and getting access to them without being captured by Evans' allies first. Daniel knew of a federal judge who made circuit rounds through the territorial settlements, a man named William Hayes who had a reputation for honesty and independence from local political pressures. Judge Hayes was due to arrive in Silver Creek, a settlement 2 days' travel from their current position, within the next week. If they could reach him and present Christina's case properly, they might be able to end their flight on terms more favorable than simple surrender. Christina listened to Daniel's plan with growing excitement, recognizing the possibility it represented for a future beyond constant flight and fear. But she also understood the risks involved in leaving their sanctuary and traveling through country where their enemies were actively searching for them. The judge might represent their best hope for justice, but reaching him would require them to expose themselves to capture by the very people they were trying to escape. The baby seemed to sense her agitation, responding with increased movement that made her wince with discomfort. Christina pressed both hands against her belly and tried to project calm, silently promising the child that whatever decisions they made would be guided by its welfare above all other considerations. This baby deserved to be born into a world where it could grow up free from the shadow of its violent conception where it could learn to trust in justice rather than fear arbitrary power. Daniel saw her distress and moved closer, his hand covering hers where it rested on her belly. The baby kicked against their joined hands as if acknowledging their presence, and Daniel felt a rush of protective instinct that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. This child might not share his blood, but it was already part of his heart in ways that defied rational explanation. The thought of anything happening to either Christina or the baby filled him with a cold rage that reminded him of the soldier he had once been. They spent the morning planning their approach to Silver Creek, studying the terrain and identifying routes that would minimize their exposure to patrols while still allowing them to reach the settlement in time for Judge Hayes's arrival. The journey would be challenging under the best of circumstances, but Christina's advancing pregnancy made every aspect more complicated and dangerous. She was now well into her 6th month, and the physical demands of mountain travel were taking an increasing toll on her stamina and mobility. The decision to leave the valley was not made lightly, but both of them understood that staying would only delay the inevitable confrontation with their enemies. Evans and his allies would eventually expand their search to include the higher elevations, and when they did, the valley's isolation would become a trap rather than a sanctuary. Better to move while they still had the element of choice, while they could still dictate the terms of their next encounter with the forces arrayed against them. As they prepared to leave their temporary refuge, Christina took a last look around the valley that had offered them such precious peace. The streams still sparkled in the morning sunlight, and the meadows still held their carpet of late wildflowers, but she knew she would probably never see this place again. It had served its purpose as a sanctuary during their darkest hour, and now it was time to return to the world of human conflict and moral complexity that awaited them beyond the protective embrace of the peaks. Daniel helped her up the steep trail that led out of the valley, his hand steady and sure as he guided her over the most difficult sections. The baby was active again, responding to her elevated heart rate and the physical exertion of the climb. Christina found herself talking to the child as they climbed, explaining in whispered words what they were doing and why it was necessary, as if the unborn baby could understand the choices that were shaping its future. The view from the ridge above the valley was spectacular, encompassing miles of wilderness that stretched toward the distant settlements where civilization had gained its tentative foothold in the Colorado Territory. Somewhere in that vast landscape, their enemies were still searching, still believing they could impose their will through superior numbers and firepower. But the mountain had taught Daniel and Christina lessons about survival that went beyond simple force, lessons about patience and cunning, and the power that came from fighting for something greater than personal ambition. The descent towards Silver Creek took them through country that Daniel knew well from his years of solitary exploration, but which felt different now that he was traveling with someone whose safety mattered more than his own. Every ridge and canyon had to be evaluated not just for its strategic value, but for its suitability for a pregnant woman whose condition made rapid movement increasingly difficult. Christina's courage never wavered, but Daniel could see the toll that constant travel was taking on her body and spirit. They made camp the first night in a grove of aspen trees that offered concealment from casual observation, while still providing multiple escape routes if discovery seemed imminent. The trees were beginning to turn with the approaching autumn, their leaves showing the first hints of the gold that would soon transform the entire mountainside into a tapestry of color. Christina sat with her back against one of the smooth white trunks and watched the play of light and shadow through the canopy above, finding peace in the simple beauty of the natural world. The baby was particularly active that evening, responding to some internal rhythm that seemed to have little connection to Christina's own activities. She placed Daniel's hand on her belly so he could feel the strong kicks and movements that spoke of a healthy, vigorous child eager to enter the world. The intimacy of the moment was profound, creating a bond between them that went beyond their shared dangers to encompass hope for a future they might build together. Daniel felt the baby move beneath his palm and was struck by the miracle of new life developing despite all the violence and chaos that surrounded its creation. This child represented possibility in its purest form, a chance for something good to emerge from circumstances that had seemed hopeless just days before. The responsibility of protecting both mother and child felt like a sacred trust, one that gave meaning to his life in ways he had not experienced since Sarah's death. They talked quietly as the fire burned low, making plans for their approach to Silver Creek and the delicate negotiations that would be required to gain access to Judge Hayes without alerting Evans' allies to their presence. The settlement was small enough that strangers would be noticed immediately, but it was also remote enough that news of their arrival might not reach hostile ears for several crucial hours. Timing would be everything in their attempt to present their case before their enemies could interfere. Christina shared her concerns about facing a formal legal proceeding, admitting that she had never been inside a courtroom and was not sure she could articulate her experiences in ways that would convince a judge of her innocence. The legal system was dominated by men who often viewed women as unreliable witnesses to their own experiences, particularly in cases involving accusations of sexual violence. Her word against Evans's would carry little weight unless she could find ways to corroborate her story with evidence that could not be dismissed. Daniel assured her that Judge Hayes had a reputation for fairness that extended to his treatment of women and other groups who were often marginalized by the territorial legal system. But he also understood her fears, recognizing that even the most well-intentioned judge would be influenced by the social prejudices of his time and place. They would need to present their case carefully, focusing on facts that could be verified and avoiding emotional appeals that might be dismissed as feminine hysteria. The second day of their journey brought them within sight of the Silver Creek, a collection of rough buildings clustered around a stream that provided water power for a small sawmill and gristmill. The settlement existed primarily to serve the needs of the scattered mining operations in the surrounding hills, but it also functioned as a regional center for the administration of territorial law. Judge Hayes would hold court in the settlement's only substantial building, a combination courthouse and community hall that served multiple purposes for the isolated community. Daniel used his spyglass to study the settlement from a concealed position on the hillside above, counting the number of horses tied to hitching posts and looking for any signs that their enemies had anticipated their destination. The town appeared normal, with the usual mix of miners, merchants, and travelers going about their daily business. But Daniel knew that appearances could be deceiving. Evans and his allies had demonstrated considerable resources and organization, and they might well have agents watching every settlement where justice might be sought. Christina felt the baby shift position inside her as they prepared for their final approach to Silver Creek, a movement that seemed almost like encouragement for the ordeal that lay ahead. She had carried this child through dangers that should have been fatal, and now they were within hours of possibly ending their flight on the terms that would allow them both to live free from fear. The thought filled her with a mixture of hope and terror that made her hands shake as she gathered her few belongings. The approach to Silver Creek required them to cross open ground where they would be visible to anyone watching from the settlement. But Daniel had timed their arrival for the late afternoon when the sun would be in the eyes of potential observers. They moved carefully but purposefully, looking like ordinary travelers seeking shelter for the night rather than fugitives fleeing from territorial authorities. Christina had changed into the cleanest clothes from Daniel's pack, garments that made her look more like a respectable woman traveling with her husband than a desperate criminal on the run. The settlement's main street was busy with the usual late-day activity as merchants prepared to close their shops and miners finished their business before heading back to their claims. Daniel and Christina moved through the crowd with careful anonymity, drawing no more attention than any other couple seeking accommodation for the night. The courthouse stood at the far end of the street, a solid stone building that represented the territorial government's attempt to impose order on the chaotic frontier society that had grown up around the mining boom. Daniel approached the courthouse clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers who looked up from his ledgers with the weary expression of someone who dealt with an endless stream of legal disputes and administrative requests. Judge Hayes was indeed in town, the clerk confirmed, and would be holding court the following morning to hear cases that had accumulated during his absence from the circuit. There was still time to file a formal complaint if they had legal business that required the judge's attention. Christina felt her heart racing as Daniel explained that they needed to file charges against Thomas Evans for assault and unlawful restraint, carefully avoiding any mention of the more serious accusations that might prejudice their case before it could be properly heard. The clerk dutifully recorded the basic information, noting Christina's condition and the serious nature of the charges being brought. The formal complaint would be served on Evans if he could be located, giving him the opportunity to respond to the accusations in a legal forum rather than through violence and intimidation. The process of filing the complaint felt surreal to Christina, who had become so accustomed to thinking of herself as an outlaw that the idea of seeking justice through legitimate channels seemed almost impossible. But the clerk treated her with the same professional courtesy he would show any other citizen seeking legal redress, asking questions about dates and circumstances without showing any sign of prejudgment about her character or credibility. For the first time in months, she felt like a person with rights rather than property to be claimed by whoever had the power to take her. Daniel arranged for a room at the settlement's only hotel, a modest establishment that catered to traveling merchants and court officials who needed accommodation during Judge Hayes' visits. The room was small but clean, with a real bed and a window that looked out on the mountains that had sheltered them during their flight. Christina sank into the single chair and felt tears of relief streaming down her face as the reality of their temporary safety began to sink in. The baby seemed to sense the change in their circumstances, settling into a more peaceful rhythm that allowed Christina to rest more comfortably than she had in days. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and watched her face in the lamplight, noting how the harsh lines of constant stress had begun to soften now that they were no longer running for their lives. The transformation was remarkable, revealing glimpses of the woman she had been before Evans's violence had forced her into desperate flight. As evening settled over Silver Creek, they could hear the normal sounds of a frontier settlement preparing for night, horses being led to stables, conversations drifting from the saloon down the street, the distant sound of a harmonica playing a melancholy tune. It was a peaceful scene that contrasted sharply with the violence and chaos that had marked their recent experience, a reminder that normal life continued even in the midst of their personal crisis. Daniel had taken the precaution of positioning himself where he could watch the street through their window, alert for any sign that their enemies had discovered their location. The settlement appeared quiet and normal, but he knew that appearances could change quickly if Evans and his allies learned of their presence. The next few hours would be critical, the calm before whatever storm their legal challenge might unleash. Christina dozed fitfully in the chair, her hand resting protectively on her belly as the baby moved gently inside her. Her dreams were filled with images of courtrooms and judges, of words spoken in formal settings that might finally give voice to the truth she had been forced to keep silent for so long. The thought of facing Evans again, even in a legal context, filled her with dread, but it also awakened the fierce determination that had carried her through the darkest moments of her flight. Morning came with the sound of activity in the street below as Silver Creek prepared for the arrival of Judge Hayes at the courthouse. Daniel woke to find Christina already awake, her hand moving in slow circles over her belly as she communicated with the child that would soon enter a world where justice might actually be possible. The baby responded with gentle movements that seemed almost like encouragement for the ordeal that lay ahead. The courthouse began filling with people well before the scheduled start of proceedings, a mix of minors with disputes to settle, merchants seeking legal remedies for broken contracts, and family members supporting those who would appear before the judge. Daniel and Christina took seats near the back of the courtroom, positioning themselves where they could observe the proceedings while remaining relatively inconspicuous among the crowd of spectators and participants. Judge Hayes proved to be a man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent traveling the frontier circuits, where territorial law was still being established. He carried himself with quiet dignity and spoke with the careful precision of someone who understood that his words carried the weight of legal authority in places where such authority was often challenged. His reputation for fairness was evident in the respectful attention he received from everyone in the courtroom. The morning's cases proceeded with the methodical pace of frontier justice, each dispute receiving careful consideration despite the informal setting and the practical limitations of territorial law enforcement. Daniel watched the judge's handling of various matters and felt encouraged by the man's obvious commitment to hearing all sides of every issue before rendering judgment. This was someone who might actually listen to Christina's story without predetermined assumptions about her character or credibility. When their case was called, Christina felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she rose to face the judge who would determine whether her flight from Evans's violence would end in justice or continued persecution. Daniel stood beside her, his presence providing moral support that helped steady her nerves as she prepared to speak publicly about experiences she had never been able to share with anyone in authority. The baby shifted inside her as if sensing the importance of the moment. Judge Hayes listened with careful attention as Christina recounted the events that had led to her flight from the Copper Creek mining camp, his expression remaining neutral as she described Evans's escalating harassment and the night of violence that had finally forced her to run. She spoke simply and directly, avoiding emotional appeals in favor of factual descriptions of what had happened and when. Her voice remained steady throughout the recitation, strengthened by the knowledge that she was finally being heard by someone with the power to act on her behalf. The judge asked pointed questions about dates and circumstances, probing for details that would help him evaluate the credibility of her account. Christina answered each query honestly, acknowledging when her memory was uncertain while providing specific information about incidents that were burned into her consciousness with perfect clarity. The formal setting gave weight to words that had previously been dismissed or ignored, transforming her personal trauma into legal testimony that demanded serious consideration. Daniel was called upon to describe the condition Christina had been in when she first appeared at his cabin, the visible evidence of violence that had convinced him to offer her protection despite the risks involved. His testimony was brief but powerful, the words of a man who had seen enough violence to recognize its aftermath when he encountered it. The judge listened with obvious interest to this corroborating account from someone with no apparent motive to lie on Christina's behalf. The proceedings were interrupted by a commotion at the back of the courtroom as Thomas Evans entered with several companions, his arm still in a sling from the wound Daniel had inflicted during their confrontation at the cabin. Evans' face was flushed with anger as he surveyed the scene, clearly unprepared for the possibility that his victims might seek legal redress rather than simply fleeing into permanent exile. His presence transformed the atmosphere in the courtroom, introducing an element of menace that made several spectators shift nervously in their seats. Judge Hayes called for order and asked Evans to identify himself and state his business before the court. Evans announced that he was the complainant in charges of theft and assault that had already been filed against Christina Alvarez, and that he was prepared to present evidence of her criminal behavior to counter whatever lies she might have told about their relationship. His voice carried the confident authority of a man accustomed to having his word accepted without question, particularly when it came to disputes with women who had no social standing to support their credibility. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Christina had ever experienced, a formal legal proceeding that gave equal weight to her testimony and that of the man who had terrorized her for months. Judge Hayes listened with careful attention to Evans's version of events, which painted Christina as a manipulative woman who had seduced him and then stolen company funds when her attempts at blackmail were rejected. According to Evans, she had attacked him when he tried to recover the stolen money, forcing him to defend himself with regrettable but necessary violence. Christina felt sick as she listened to Evans' lies, each falsehood delivered with such conviction that she could see some of the spectators beginning to nod in agreement. This was the power that men like Evans wielded, the ability to reshape reality through the force of their social position and the prejudices of those who heard their stories. Her own account, no matter how truthful, would always be seen as less reliable simply because she was a woman with no family or social connections to vouch for her character. But Judge Hayes proved to be more perceptive than Evans had anticipated, asking pointed questions about the specific nature of the alleged theft and the circumstances surrounding the violent confrontation Evans described. Under careful questioning, Evans' story began to show inconsistencies and gaps that suggested a carefully constructed fiction rather than a truthful account of actual events. The judge's experience with frontier justice had taught him to recognize the difference between genuine grievances and attempts to use the legal system to legitimize personal vendettas. Daniel was recalled to testify about the condition of Evans and his men when they had arrived at his cabin, their obvious intent to use violence rather than legal process to resolve their dispute with Christina. His description of the armed assault on his property and the threats made against a pregnant woman painted a picture that contradicted Evans's claims of seeking peaceful resolution through proper channels. The physical evidence of the gunfight, including Evans's own wound, supported Daniel's account of events. The turning point came when Judge Hayes asked Christina to provide specific details about the company funds Evans claimed she had stolen. Christina was able to demonstrate her thorough knowledge of the store's accounting procedures and her careful maintenance of financial records that would have made theft both difficult and easily detected. More importantly, she was able to produce documentation that she had carried with her during her flight, records that showed no discrepancies in the accounts she had managed during her employment. Evans's inability to provide specific details about the alleged theft, combined with his obvious discomfort when questioned about his own conduct toward female employees, began to undermine his credibility with the judge. His companions, who had been prepared to support his version of events, found themselves unable to provide corroborating testimony about incidents they claimed to have witnessed. The careful structure of lies that Evans had constructed began to collapse under the weight of judicial scrutiny. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, visible even through Christina's dress as the child responded to her elevated stress levels. The sight of her obvious pregnancy and the physical evidence of the advanced stage of her condition added weight to her testimony about the timeline of events she had described. Judge Hayes noted the timing carefully, his expression suggesting that he was drawing conclusions about the relationship between Christina's condition and the circumstances that had led to her flight. Christina felt a surge of hope as she realized that the judge was actually listening to her story with the serious attention it deserved, treating her testimony as credible evidence rather than the hysterical ramblings of an unreliable woman. For the first time since Evans had begun his campaign of harassment, she felt like someone in authority was actually considering the possibility that she was telling the truth about what had happened to her. Evans's growing desperation became evident as he realized that his carefully planned legal strategy was failing to achieve its intended result. He began making increasingly wild accusations, claiming that Christina and Daniel were part of some larger conspiracy against the mining company and its legitimate business interests. His voice rose as he demanded that the judge recognize his authority as a company representative and accept his word over that of criminals and outcasts who had no standing in respectable society. Judge Hayes's response was swift and decisive, his voice carrying the full weight of legal authority as he called for order in his courtroom. Evans's outburst had revealed more about his character than hours of careful testimony, demonstrating the kind of man who believed his position gave him the right to intimidate and abuse those under his authority. The judge's expression made it clear that such behavior would not be tolerated in his courtroom, regardless of the social standing of the person exhibiting it. The formal judgment that followed was more comprehensive than Christina had dared to hope, addressing not only the immediate charges Evans had filed, but also the broader pattern of abuse and intimidation that had forced her to flee the mining camp. Judge Hayes found no credible evidence to support the accusations of theft and assault that Evans had brought against Christina, noting the inconsistencies in his testimony and the lack of corroborating evidence for his claims. More significantly, the judge found probable cause to believe that Evans had engaged in criminal assault against Christina and issued a warrant for his arrest on those charges. The transformation in the courtroom atmosphere was immediate and dramatic, as Evans found himself facing the very legal consequences he had tried to impose on his victim. His companions, who had been confident in their ability to manipulate the territorial legal system, suddenly found themselves associated with a man who was now officially accused of criminal behavior. The social dynamics that had protected Evans throughout his career at the mining company were suddenly working against him as people distanced themselves from his obvious legal troubles. Christina felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost overwhelming, her body sagging with the release of tension she had carried for months. The baby responded to her emotional state with increased movement, as if celebrating the victory that would allow it to be born into a world where justice was actually possible. Daniel's hand found hers and squeezed gently, a gesture of support and shared triumph that spoke of the bond forged between them during their desperate flight through the mountains. But even as the immediate legal victory was being achieved, Daniel remained alert to the practical realities of their situation. Evans might be facing arrest, but he still had allies and resources that could be turned against them outside the formal legal system. The mining company that employed him would not simply accept this reversal without attempting to protect their investment in his authority and the precedent his case might set for other women who had suffered similar abuse. Judge Hayes addressed this concern directly, ordering that Christina be placed under the court's protection until Evans could be properly arrested and the broader investigation into conditions at the Copper Creek mine could be completed. The territorial authorities would provide security to ensure that no retaliation could be taken against her for her courageous decision to seek legal redresses for the wrong she had suffered. The baby she carried would be born under the protection of the law rather than in hiding from those who would harm them both. The practical arrangements that followed moved with surprising efficiency as the judge's orders mobilized resources that Christina had not known existed. A federal marshal who had been traveling with Judge Hayes took custody of Evans, despite the protests of his companions who claimed that territorial authorities had no jurisdiction over mining company personnel. The marshal's response made it clear that crimes against persons trumped any corporate immunity the company might claim for its employees. Christina was provided with secure accommodation and medical attention for the first time since discovering her pregnancy, luxuries that felt almost overwhelming after months of constant flight and fear. A local doctor examined her and pronounced both mother and child to be in remarkably good health considering the ordeal they had endured, though he recommended extended rest and proper nutrition to prepare for the birth that was now only a few months away. Daniel found himself in the unexpected position of being thanked by territorial authorities for his role in protecting Christina and bringing her case to legal attention. His actions, which had felt like simple moral necessity at the time, were now being recognized as heroic intervention that had prevented a serious miscarriage of justice. The transformation from outlaw to hero was disorienting, but it also opened possibilities for a future that had seemed impossible just days before. As evening settled over Silver Creek, Christina sat by the window of her secure room and watched the mountains where she and Daniel had found sanctuary during their darkest hours. The peaks were beginning to show the first dusting of snow that announced the approaching winter, a reminder that the seasons continued their ancient cycle regardless of human struggles and triumphs. The baby moved gently inside her, responding to her peaceful state with its own version of contentment. The legal victory was significant, but Christina understood that the real work of building a new life was just beginning. Evans's arrest would send a message to other men who believed their positions gave them the right to abuse women under their authority. But changing the broader culture that enabled such abuse would require sustained effort from many people over many years. She had struck one blow for justice, but the war for equality and respect would continue long after her own case was resolved. The weeks that followed brought a series of developments that transformed Christina's legal victory into something approaching genuine justice. The investigation into conditions at the Copper Creek mine revealed a pattern of abuse and intimidation that went far beyond Evans' personal conduct, exposing a corporate culture that had systematically exploited vulnerable workers while using violence and legal manipulation to suppress complaints. Other women came forward with their own stories of harassment and assault, creating a body of evidence that could not be dismissed or ignored. Daniel remained close throughout the legal proceedings, his presence providing both practical support and emotional stability as Christina navigated the complex process of formal justice. Their relationship deepened during this period of relative safety, moving beyond the desperate alliance forged during their flight to become something that resembled a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. The baby seemed to approve of this development, responding to Daniel's presence with increased activity whenever he was near. The mining company's attempts to discredit Christina and dismiss the charges against Evans proved futile in the face of mounting evidence and Judge Hayes' determination to see justice done. Corporate lawyers who arrived from Denver found themselves facing a legal system that was more independent and principled than they had expected, their usual tactics of intimidation and influence peddling proving ineffective against a judge who took his responsibilities seriously. Evans himself proved to be a broken man when confronted with the full weight of legal consequences for his actions. The confident authority he had wielded at the mining camp crumbled when stripped of corporate protection and faced with the prospect of actual punishment for his crimes. His attempts to negotiate plea agreements and reduce sentences only served to further confirm his guilt and the systematic nature of his abuse of power. The birth of Christina's child came in late November, during the first major snowstorm of the winter that would soon close the mountain passes and isolate Silver Creek from the outside world. The baby was a healthy girl with dark eyes and strong lungs, announcing her arrival with cries that seemed to celebrate the freedom she had been born into. Christina held her daughter for the first time and felt a completeness that had nothing to do with the legal victories and everything to do with the miracle of new life emerging from the darkness of the past year. Daniel was present for the birth, having earned his place in the makeshift family through months of unwavering support and protection. When the doctor placed the baby in his arms, he felt a surge of love and responsibility that was no different from what any biological father might experience. This child was his daughter in every way that mattered, and he was prepared to spend his life ensuring that she grew up in a world where her mother's courage and strength would be celebrated rather than punished. The question of the baby's paternity became irrelevant in the face of the love and commitment that surrounded her from the moment of birth. Whether her biological father was Thomas Evans or Robert Martinez, she would grow up knowing herself to be wanted and cherished by the people who chose to be her family. Daniel and Christina had learned that the bonds created by choice and dedication were stronger than those imposed by biology or circumstance. The legal resolution of Evans's case came in the spring, when the accumulated evidence of his crimes finally resulted in a conviction and prison sentence that reflected the seriousness of his offenses. The mining company, faced with mounting legal liability and public scrutiny, agreed to substantial financial settlements for Christina and the other women who had suffered under Evans' authority. More importantly, they implemented new policies and oversight procedures designed to prevent similar abuses in the future. Christina used her settlement money to purchase land in the valley where she and Daniel had found sanctuary during their flight, transforming their temporary refuge into a permanent home where their daughter could grow up surrounded by the natural beauty and peace that had sheltered them during their darkest hours. The Hidden Valley became a working ranch where they raised horses and cattle, creating a life that was both practical and fulfilling. The transformation was complete in ways that went beyond the legal and financial resolution of their immediate problems. Christina had evolved from a frightened victim into a strong woman who understood her own worth and was prepared to fight for what she believed in. Daniel had emerged from his self-imposed isolation to become part of a family that gave meaning and purpose to his existence. Their daughter would grow up knowing that justice was possible and that courage could triumph over cruelty when good people were willing to stand together. Years passed, and the story of Christina and Daniel's fight for justice became part of the local folklore, told around campfires and in saloons as an example of what could be achieved when ordinary people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Their ranch in the Hidden Valley prospered, becoming a symbol of the possibility for redemption and new beginnings that the frontier offered to those brave enough to seize the opportunities it presented. Their daughter, whom they named Sarah in honor of Daniel's first wife, grew up strong and confident, shaped by parents who had learned the importance of standing up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. She inherited her mother's intelligence and determination, along with her adoptive father's quiet strength and practical wisdom, becoming the kind of person who would carry forward their legacy of courage and principle into the next generation. The mining industry in Colorado continued to evolve, with the precedent set by Christina's case contributing to gradual improvements in working conditions and legal protections for vulnerable employees. While progress was slow and often resisted by corporate interests, the principle that no one's position gave them the right to abuse those under their authority became more firmly established in territorial law and social custom. Christina remained active in efforts to support other women who found themselves in situations similar to what she had experienced, using her own story and resources to help establish networks of assistance and legal advocacy. The Hidden Valley became a refuge not just for her own family, but for others who needed temporary shelter while rebuilding their lives after escaping from abusive situations. Daniel found purpose in this work as well, using his knowledge of the mountains and his skills as a protector to help other fugitives reach safety when legal remedies were not immediately available. The man who had once sought solitude in the wilderness discovered that his greatest fulfillment came from being part of a community dedicated to helping those who could not help themselves. The ranch became a gathering place for people who shared their values, creating an extended family of choice that included former miners, displaced women, territorial officials who believed in justice, and others who had been touched by their story. Young Sarah grew up surrounded by adults who had all learned in their own ways that survival required both individual courage and collective support. As Christina approached middle age, she often reflected on the journey that had brought her from the desperate flight through the mountains to the peaceful prosperity of the Valley Ranch. The scars from her ordeal with Evans had faded but never completely disappeared. serving as reminders of how quickly safety could be lost and how precious the freedom she had won truly was. But they were balanced by the deeper satisfaction that came from knowing she had fought for justice and won, not just for herself, but for others who would benefit from the precedent her courage had established. The baby who had been conceived in violence and carried through desperate flight had grown into a young woman who embodied hope and possibility, living proof that good could emerge from the darkest circumstances when people refused to surrender to despair. Sarah's existence was a daily reminder that the future was not determined by the circumstances of the past, but by the choices made by those who were willing to fight for something better. Daniel's transformation from isolated hermit to devoted family man and community leader was equally remarkable, demonstrating that it was never too late for people to discover new purposes and connections that gave meaning to their existence. The mountains that had once been his refuge from human contact became the foundation for a life devoted to protecting and nurturing others, proving that solitude and community were not necessarily opposing choices, but different phases in a life lived with intention and principle. The legal system that had seemed so threatening during their flight gradually evolved into something more responsive to the needs of ordinary people, partly as a result of cases like Christina's that forced judges and lawmakers to confront the realities of frontier life. While perfect justice remained elusive, the principle that everyone deserved protection under the law became more firmly established with each successful challenge to abuse and corruption. The final chapter of their story was written not in dramatic confrontations or legal victories, but in the quiet accumulation of peaceful days and ordinary joys that comprised a life well lived. Christina and Daniel grew old together in the valley that had sheltered them during their greatest crisis, watching their daughter mature into a woman who carried forward their values while creating her own unique contribution to the world. Sarah married a young lawyer who shared her parents' commitment to justice, establishing a legal practice that specialized in representing people who had been failed by the system's traditional approaches to resolving disputes. Their children grew up hearing stories of their grandparents' courage and learning that standing up for what was right was both a privilege and a responsibility that came with being part of a free society. The Hidden Valley remained a working ranch, but it also became a symbol of the possibility for transformation and redemption that the American frontier offered to those brave enough to seize the opportunities it presented. Visitors came from across the territory to see the place where justice had triumphed over corruption, where love had emerged from violence, and where two people had discovered that their individual struggles were part of a larger story about the human capacity for growth and change. Christina's memoirs, written in her later years, became an important document in the history of women's rights in the American West, providing a first-hand account of both the challenges and the possibilities that frontier life offered to those who were willing to fight for their principles. Her story inspired other women to seek legal redress for wrongs they had suffered, contributing to gradual but significant improvements in the status of women throughout the territorial period. Daniel's reputation as a protector and guide led to his appointment as a territorial ranger, a position that allowed him to use his knowledge of the mountains and his commitment to justice in service of the broader community. He spent his later years helping to establish the legal and social infrastructure that would eventually transform the Colorado Territory into a state where the rule of law provided genuine protection for all citizens regardless of their social status or economic position. The mine where Christina's ordeal had begun was eventually abandoned as the silver deposits played out. But the lessons learned from the investigation into conditions there contributed to lasting reforms in labor relations throughout the mining industry. The precedent established by Evans's conviction became part of the legal foundation for worker protection laws that would benefit future generations of men and women who sought honest work in dangerous industries. As winter settled over the valley in what would prove to be Daniel's final year, he and Christina sat by their fireplace and watched their granddaughter play with toys carved from mountain pine. The circle was complete in ways that neither of them could have imagined during their desperate flight through the high country decades before. The baby who had been carried through danger and uncertainty had grown up to create her own family, ensuring that the values and principles they had fought for would continue into the next generation. The mountains that surrounded their valley were unchanged by the human dramas that had played out in their shadow, still offering the same combination of beauty and challenge that had shaped the characters of all who encountered them. But the people who lived among those peaks were different. Touched by the example of courage and principle, that Christina and Daniel had provided during their moment of greatest trial. The story ended not with dramatic flourishes or triumphant declarations, but with the quiet satisfaction that came from lives lived with purpose and integrity. Christina and Daniel had discovered that true victory lay not in defeating their enemies, but in refusing to be diminished by the cruelty they had encountered. They had built something good from the ashes of their separate tragedies, creating a legacy of hope that would inspire others long after their own struggles had become memory. In the end, the beaten pregnant girl who had stumbled into a Manitan man's clearing had become a woman whose courage changed the world around her, while the hermit who had asked "Who hurt you?" had discovered that healing others was the path to healing himself. Their love story was written not in grand gestures, but in daily choices to stand together against whatever challenges life might bring, proving that the most powerful force in human experience was the simple decision to care for one another, regardless of the cost.